It is Thursday morning, May 9th, 2024, and welcome to another edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted. As always, Jeremy and I are here to share some thoughts about the hottest news of the day, and to do it in a very civil and calm both presentation and response. And so, Jer, good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Good, thanks. What's on your mind?
So, I was thinking that here we are, we're almost in the summer, right? And I don't know about you, but over the last 3 or 4 years going into the summer, I'm always anticipating what's the summer going to be like politically, especially after what occurred in 2020, right? That was a pretty momentous summer going into the election. And so I'm thinking from two angles here, in the short term and in the long term. It's an election cycle. What's this summer going to be like? What are the issues, the 2 or 3 issues that are going to be front and center through the summer? And how is that going to impact the election? And then, is this going to be a pivotal summer, or more specifically, a summer that will go down in history? Will historians of the future look back at the summer of 2024, and how might they see it? Now, a lot of this is speculation. We're watching these trends build in the moment, but I thought maybe that's a good springboard into a discussion as we get ready for the summer of 2024 going into the 2024 election.
Yep, sounds good to me, and sounds like, as I've heard you say many times before, like 1968, a year of chaos and a year of change, a momentous period. And for those of us old enough to have experienced it directly, that was my first political campaign, or to have read extensively about it. You had the coming together of a number of things that kind of parallel today. Number one, tremendous changes in civil rights, and in the emphasis of the civil rights movement. At the same time, tremendous change in the Cold War and how we went to war, from fighting traditional wars to fighting guerrilla wars, from fighting big nations to a superpower fighting a small nation, and a country that had really just given up on the Vietnam War and was perilously split over it. You had a student movement that was demographic in many ways. Baby boomers in college, the largest single age cohort in American history up to that point, and now with their own field, their own playground, their own headquarters, in order to make change, student rights, but also civil rights, and so on. And you had violence. It was a coming together of powerful establishment forces, but a growing, powerful anti-force. And fast forward to today, look at it. We've talked about it. You have a breakdown of the political parties. You have a growing, not only independence, but growing sense of giving up or distrust of the system. You have the two oldest men running for president at a time when it's going to be young people who ultimately make the decision whether they turn out to vote or not. And you have demographic changes in how America is viewed and what role it can play in the world. You have anxiety over jobs and the supermarket. You have artificial intelligence, and the next year and the next 4 years are going to be momentous. These changes are only going to continue. So there is chaos. I think there are 2 issues, however, that will dominate this summer. We might even see Chicago 68 redux in Chicago of 2024. But those two issues, these will be the determinants of the election. Number one is abortion rights. It may not be the number one issue when you poll people, but it's a highly intense issue, and it's what we call a bullet issue. Those who favor abortion rights are mobilized, intense, ready to vote, and they've been voting Democrat. On the flip side is the equivalent today of the powerful Vietnam issue of 1968. And in a word, that's Gaza. And for young people who are of mixed race and have different identities, Gazans are not people who are them, but people who are us. And kids feel that they're watching genocide take place. Don't believe polls that say, oh, the kids don't matter. It is a highly, they don't really, or that they don't really care about this issue. They care intensely, and they're seeing it played out online and on TV. And in a nutshell, it represents the power elite of the Democratic Party versus an insurgency of young people who are the future of this country. And I'm afraid, just as it is loggerheads on coming to loggerheads on campus today, that it will come to loggerheads in Chicago this summer at the Democratic National Convention.
Wow. Yeah. I touching on the issues you mentioned, abortion rights. I mean, look, that's been important for 50 years now. That's played a role in every national election cycle. Of course, it's been reinvigorated by the 2-year-old revisiting of the Dobbs decision back in leading up to the midterm elections in 2022. I do think it will have its place, but I do think that there are some other issues that could overwhelm it. Now, I often talk about inflation and the standard of living. I'm actually going to get more nuanced, and I'm going to say, from the vantage point of these protesters, who I think are going to embody potentially a mobilization of a voting bloc, that is, those who are 18 to 24, more specifically first-time voters, and in generally voters in their 20s. I think what we're witnessing on the campuses recently is going to go into the summer, spill over into the summer, and I think what it portends is a large turnout, potentially a large turnout of young voters. I think they're going to be awakened by this. I think that perhaps they could be going through their own personal awakening. And so what started out, no question about it, with young voters on TikTok, on social media in general, complaining about Biden inflation and complaining about the cost of living and complaining about having no good access to good jobs, I think is really going to shape out to be more about their future, not just about the cost of living now, not just about, hey, I can't afford the life that I thought I was going to have, but just a concern in general of their future. What is my future? What is it going to be like? And how is this election going to play a role? And I think that is going to be front and center. I think Gaza is huge because Gaza not only represents the foreign policy, the failure of American foreign policy, right? These kids, even my generation, I mean, as early as 7th grade, we were watching documentaries on the Holocaust. Imagine that. I don't know about previous generations, but it seemed to be that my generation, the millennials, we learned, whether it was in history class or even literature class, the Holocaust and genocide found its way into a lot of other subjects. And we were exposed to a lot of documentaries, and it was all under the guise of never again. And you can imagine that Generation Z, I would argue, got even more of that. And here they are. They go on TikTok and they see these awful images, and they see people, children, babies, women being indiscriminately killed, and there's footage of it, and they're outraged by it. And they're supposed to say, I thought this was never supposed to happen again. And here we are, this administration is essentially supporting it. So Gaza represents human rights. It represents the failure of American diplomacy, but it also represents something very importantly on the domestic front, and that is free speech. These kids are, and they are kids, but young adults too. They are used to going online and being unfiltered. I mean, that's essentially how they grew up. They grew up digitally. They grew up on social media platforms, and for the first time, they're looking at the political landscape, and what they're seeing is, no, we're actually going to shadow ban you. 4 years ago, that was really just supposed to happen to right-wing nationalists. That was just supposed to happen to Trump voters, and it was supposed to happen to MAGA people. But no, now it's happening to young people. You have to be careful what you say. You have to be careful what you share, and if you don't, you might be shadow banned. And so Gaza is a convergence of diplomacy, of foreign policy, and free speech, a triple whammy, and something that I think deeply affects them. And as I mentioned, the loss of hope of their future. And so I see the potential for what I'm calling an awakening, but really what I mean is a coming of age politically, and the chance for a massive turnout of young voters.
That was brilliant. I'm wondering about the mass turnout, because I honestly don't know. Because ultimately, they're going to have to vote for somebody, and though more than likely they would vote Democrat than Republican, but the Democrat is providing a series of disappointments, and Gaza is only one of those disappointments. Inflation still rears its ugly head, but it seems to me that the overriding issue is anxiety, and it's anxiety, to be fair, on both sides of the equation. We've already talked about the students, and about young people in general, and add to the mix anxiety over inflation and over jobs and of working with machines and what all that portends. But to be fair, let's look at the Trump voter too. Trump voter who is saying, I'm losing the familiarity of my surroundings. Call it the American dream or call it the middle class, but I'm really fearful for my status as a middle class person. What's happening to me? The border. The border is being penetrated. It has been penetrated by people who don't look like me. I look out my window, and this is not simply in Laredo or West Texas on the border. It is also in communities throughout this country, and I don't see people that look like me anymore. I don't see my kids hanging out with their neighbors anymore. They're online and they're talking to people who don't look like us. So I'm concerned about immigration and what it portends for me. I'm concerned about AI, and not just simply losing my job, but losing my status and either having to be retrained or having to be counted in the census along with my coworker who happens to be a robot. I'm looking at an America that was not that long ago able to say we are the moral force in this country, in this world, and what we say goes. And America is kind of like an empty superpower, without the arsenal or the moral authority that it once had. And so I'm trying really hard, these Trump voters are saying, to hold on to what we have, to have stability, to end the swamp. And here's a guy who promises to do that. Here's a guy who says and expresses a lot of my frustrations the way that I wish that I could, and can get away with it too. So I don't want to leave this conversation with any thought that I represent a kind of liberal thinking that says Trump supporters are a basket full of deplorables, or as Obama said, oh, they got their guns in religion and don't deal with real issues. These are real issues, but they've come to a head on both sides, and it's tied. So here's my concern. I honestly fear, protests to the contrary notwithstanding, I have a real fear that neither side is going to accept the winner of the election. Mm-hmm. And that's Civil War stuff.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly fleshed that out quite a bit. And I have talked about the fact that it's a horror film movie franchise in the making. I call it Nightmare on Liberty Street, Part 3. We know what happened in Part 1, 2016. We know that Hillary Clinton and her, look, I don't care what anyone says, you can't convince me of this. She conceded, but she didn't concede. She was talking out of both sides of her mouth. It was, classic Clintonian style nonsense. She was a sore loser, and her constituency went into I don't even, you can't even say a tizzy. I mean, it was a toddler temper tantrum, and they disrupted democracy. Look, one of the favorite newspapers among liberals and Democrats, the Washington Post, had a banner every day drilled into their readers' heads in black: "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, don't you think they had a role in killing democracy? We can talk about that another time. I want to hit on immigration. I don't think it's so much look, we've seen it in the polls. Immigration is not just a top issue among Republicans. It's a top issue among independents, and it's a growing concern among Democratic voters. It is. It's not at the top, but it's certainly not at the bottom. And so what that tells me is I don't think it's so much this old whiteness and this terror that our country is getting overrun by people who don't look like us. America hasn't really looked white for quite a long time now. I think most Americans have grown accustomed to the fact that we are a multicultural nation. I mean, multiculturalism has been the de facto style of public school history for quite some time now. I mean, look, farmers hire Nicaraguans and to work on their farm, and that's not slavery. People who work in meat plants are working alongside Hispanics, whether it's Arizona, New Mexico, or Texas, and you live on those border states and you're white, you live in a state that is considerably, the voting bloc is made up of Hispanics. So I think what's more or less the concern about immigration is the notion that there's a lawlessness behind it, and that there's a very, very dark, sinister aspect that comes with it, such as human trafficking and drug trafficking, and that there's an apocalyptic feature to the whole thing. The last thing I'll say about turnout is, I wouldn't predict massive turnout. I think there's the potential. You brought up a brilliant point. Ultimately, these young voters are going to have to select somebody. They're going to have to select somebody, but our polls show currently, and they have for a while, and other polls are showing this too, that Trump is doing better among the under 30 as we speak, and for some time now than Biden is. And then you also have this third party phenomenon, this independent candidate RFK Jr., who does well among them too. And so, look, anything can happen between now and November, but I do see a potential if some candidate can really capture them and really connect with them, especially on the issues we talked about: free speech, Gaza, abortion, and just the sense of offering a more hopeful vision of the future, then I see it off to the races.
And Jared, that's the tall order. Is there a candidate who can find a vision for the future? And the difficulty is that you have two men who really represent in many ways the past, both in terms of age and in terms of ideas. We'll just have to see. Have a good week, okay?
Well, I got one question. I want folks to write to us since we're talking about the summer of 2024, and it's an election season, and you brought up 1968. What is the soundtrack of this summer going to be? I've got a few songs here, but I'd like to offer choices, but folks can certainly give us their own take. Is it going to be For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield? Is it going to be Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones? Hot Time Summer in the City by the Lovin' Spoonful? Or Four Dead in Ohio?
Well, you're going right back to My Season. That was all in the late 60s and 1970. I think the soundtrack could be decidedly something hip hop, and I'm not as schooled in hip hop as you are in my music, or any of Taylor Swift's angry songs about being mad at her boyfriend and hence mad at the world. But I want to hear what other people have to say. Please, as Jared suggests, please write to us with the title of some songs. Have a good week.
You too.